The year is 1902. A frontier town called Kimberley, carved from the dust of the South African veldt, shimmers under a sun that feels less like a star and more like a forge. In the center of this town, there is a wound in the earth. It is not a mine, it is a crater, a man-made abyss so vast it seems to swallow the sky itself. At its rim, a young man stands. His name is Ernest Oppenheimer. He is 22 years old, a German immigrant with a letter of introduction crumpled in his pocket and a gaze that does not flinch from the chasm below. He watches as windlasses creak, hauling buckets of blue-ground rock from the depths, a relentless rhythm of extraction. The sound is not just iron and stone, it is the heartbeat of an empire yet to be born. Below, in that hole, men toil in a perpetual twilight, their lungs coated in dust, their lives measured in carats. Above, Ernest feels the weight of the sun and the weight of a future pressing down on his shoulder. He does not come here to dig. He comes here to own the hole, to own the sky above it, and to own the light that glints from the stones they unearth. In this moment, a dynasty does not begin with a coronation. It begins with a young man staring into a pit, calculating the precise geometry of power. To understand the empire they would build from the dust of a continent, we must first descend into the darkness from which it was carved. The train from Cape Town moves slowly, as if reluctant to commit to the interior. For Ernest Oppenheimer, pressed against the window in the summer of 1902, every mile north is a step away from the formal gardens and whitewashed civility of the coast, and a step deeper into a raw, unpolished world. The landscape transformed. The lush fynbos gives way to scrubland, then to an endless, tawny savanna that shimmers with heat. He is a young man of 22, his face still carrying the softness of youth, but his eyes, dark, fixed, and unnervingly patient, belong to someone much older. He carries two things: a small leather suitcase containing all his worldly possessions and a letter. The letter, more valuable than gold, is from the London banking house of N.M. Rothschild & Sons, a formal introduction to the diamond magnates of Kimberley. It is his key to a city built not on law, but on the will of men who had stared into a hole and decided to own it. He disembarks into a world of noise and grit. Kimberley in 1902 is a city of contrast. There are wide, electric-lit streets with grand hotels and opera houses where men in starched collars sip champagne and discuss the price of carrots as if discussing the weather. A few blocks away, there are corrugated iron shanties, dusty saloons, and the ceaseless, grinding chaos of the mine. But the heart of it all, the thing that pulls at every man's gaze, is the big hole. It is a monstrous excavation, nearly 200 meters deep, a man-made canyon that the locals call Die Groot Gap. As Ernest approaches the rim for the first time, the sound hits him first. A constant, percussive din of hammers on rock, the groan of iron wheels, and the distant, shouted commands in a dozen languages: English, Dutch, Xhosa, German. He peers over the edge. The sight is a descent into an industrial hell. He sees a web of ropes and ladders clinging to the sheer walls. He sees the heads of men, tiny as ants, moving in the shadows far below. They are not miners in the romantic sense. They are laborers contracted, and they haul baskets of the blue-green rock, the blue ground, up to the surface where it will be spread out to weather, to crumble, to reveal the glittering secrets within. For Ernest, this is not a pit. It is a machine. A machine that has churned out fortunes for the likes of Cecil Rhodes, Barney Barnato, and Alfred Bate. And now that machine has a broken part. Rhodes is dead. Barnato is dead by his own hand. The consolidation they had forged, the monolithic De Beers Consolidated Mines, is floundering, its stock a fraction of its former value. The empire is in disarray. To most, it is a warning. To Ernest Oppenheimer, it is an invitation. He is not a miner. He is a diamantaire. There is a difference. A miner digs for stone. A diamantaire deals in value, in perception, in the architecture of markets. Ernest's entry point is not the pit, but the office. He begins as a buyer for a London firm, a middleman, a man who makes his living by knowing the price of a rough stone before it is cut. But from the beginning, he operates with a vision that transcends mere profit. He watches the chaotic flow of diamonds from Kimberley to London, the auctions, the haggling, the speculator. He sees how a flood of stones can crater the price, and how a scarcity can send it soaring. He understands the fundamental fragility of the product. A diamond is a useless thing, a crystalline carbon. Its value is a collective hallucination, a spell that can be broken by the simple act of digging up too many of them. In the dusty, sun-scorched clubs of Kimberley. Men mistake him for a quiet clerk. They see a German Jew with a thick accent and a deferential manner. They do not see the ambition that coils within him like a spring. They do not see the nights he spends poring over geological surveys, tracing the veins of blue ground across the continent, mapping a future where the chaos he witnesses becomes order. He learns the personalities as carefully as he learns the geology. He cultivates relationships with the men who survived the rush, the diggers who had staked their claims in the mud of the 1870s. He listens to their stories of roads, the colossus who had swallowed their independent claims one by one, who had built De Beers not by mining the best stone, but by controlling the water pumps and the labor. Ernest sees the blueprint. Rhodes's empire was built on the brute force of monopoly. Ernest's will be built on something more enduring, financial engineering and a global cartel. He knows he must start with the source. He cannot challenge De Beers and Kimberley directly, not yet. So he looks westward to the vast, arid expanse of German Southwest Africa, a territory of his homeland where rumors persist of diamonds lying in the sand, untouched. In 1908, a railroad worker named August Stauch discovers a stone glinting in the desert near Luderitz. The news sends a tremor through the industry. A new diamond, a threat of chaos. For Ernest, it is not a threat. It is his opportunity. He moves swiftly, securing the backing of his Rothschild contacts and the German banks. He forms the Diamond Corporation of South Africa, a name chosen with deliberate ambition. He becomes the gatekeeper for the German diamonds, the man who will bring them to market not in a flood, but in a controlled stream. By the time the Great War engulfs Europe in 1914, Ernest Oppenheimer is no longer a clerk. He is a power. He is knighted for his services to the British Empire, a German knight, a curious paradox in a time of war, and he takes his seat at the high table of global finance. But his eyes have never left the prize. He has built his base in the but the heart of the diamond world still beats in Kimberley, in the old, faltering body of and he knows that to truly control the light, one must first control the darkness from which it is pulled. As he watches the smoke rise from the battlefields of Europe, he understands that the old world is collapsing, and in the rubble of the old order, a new kind of empire will rise. His empire. The game for De Beers has only just begun. The First World War did not just redraw the borders of nations, it shattered the delicate economic architecture of the diamond trade. The glittering spires of pre-war Europe, where the wealthy had adorned themselves with jewels as a matter of course, gave way to the grim pragmatism of trenches and rationing. The market, so carefully managed by the old De Beers monopoly, collapsed. By 1919, the company that Cecil Rhodes had built was a shell, its stock virtually worthless, its mines flooded and idle. For most, it was a corpse. For Sir Ernest Oppenheimer, now a naturalized Briton and a member of Parliament for Kimberley, it was a corpse waiting for a resurrectionist. He understood that the old model of monopoly, the Rhodes model of brutal direct ownership, was broken. It bred resentment, invited government intervention, and was too brittle to survive a global shock. His vision was more sophisticated. He dreamed of a cartel, a global syndicate where the illusion of competition was maintained while the supply chain was locked down tighter than a vault. But to build it, he needed the cornerstone. He needed De Beers. His strategy was not a hostile takeover in the modern corporate sense. It was a slow, patient, suffocating embrace. He began by buying up De Beers shares on the open market, quietly, through a web of front company. He cultivated relationships with the old Rhodesian faction, the men who had inherited the Rhodes mantle, and convinced them that he was not a conqueror but a steward, a man who could restore their fortunes. In 1926, he made his decisive move. He merged his own mining interests, the powerful Anglo-American corporation he had founded in Johannesburg to exploit the gold reefs, with the ailing De Beers. It was presented as a merger of equals, a strategic alliance. In reality, it was a coronation. Ernest Oppenheimer stepped into the chairman's seat of De Beers, the very seat once occupied by the man whose ghost he had been chasing for a quarter of a century. He now controlled the vast majority of the world's diamond production. But controlling production was only half the battle. The true test, The fire that would forge his empire into something unbreakable came not from a rival, but from the earth itself. The discovery was made in 1927 in the stark, lunar landscape of southwest Africa. The diamonds there were not buried in deep volcanic pipes like those at Kimberley. They lay on the surface, scattered across the beaches and the desert sands, exposed by the wind and the tides. They were, in the miners' phrase, free digging. The implications were terrifying. If these diamonds could be collected simply by walking and scooping, the market would be flooded. The spell that gave diamonds their value, the spell of rarity, would be broken forever. Small-time prospectors, adventurers, and speculators descended upon the coastline. They set up makeshift camps, their headlamps cutting through the coastal fog as they combed the beaches at night. The price of diamonds began to slide, slowly at first, then with the sickening acceleration of a stone dropped into a well. Ernest watched from his offices in Johannesburg, a city of gold that he was simultaneously transforming with his Anglo-American corporation, building the infrastructure for a mining empire that would eventually span the continent. But the diamond crisis required a response not of dynamite and steam shovels, but of pure, cold calculation. He understood that the problem was not the diamonds themselves, but the chaos of their distribution. If he could not stop the stones from coming out of the ground, he would have to control them the moment they hit the market. In 1930, in the depths of the Great Depression, when banks were failing and the global economy was contracting into a black hole, Ernest Oppenheimer launched his masterstroke. He gathered the leaders of every major diamond producer in the world, the De Beers mines, the Southwest African fields, the Belgian Congo, Angola, and he proposed a solution. They would create a single, monolithic sales organization. It would be called the Diamond Corporation. Every producer would sell their entire output to this corporation at a price the corporation determined. In return, they would receive stability. No more price wars, no more gluts, no more chaotic auction. The Diamond Corporation would then release those stones to the market at a steady, controlled rate, creating the illusion of perpetual scarcity. It was a cartel, a global monopoly more complete than anything Rhodes had ever dreamed of. It required the producers to surrender their autonomy, to trust a single man with their economic lifeblood. And that man, seated at the head of the table, was Ernest Oppenheimer. He did not beg. He did not threaten. He presented the logic of collective survival in the face of catastrophe. He offered them a lifeboat in a storm of their own making. One by one, they agreed. The Diamond Corporation was born, and with it, the modern diamond industry. Ernest had not just weathered the flood, he had built the dam. From his London headquarters, the nerve center of this new order, he extended his control. He forged an alliance with the Soviet Union, the new, unlikely partner that had discovered vast diamond fields in Siberia. He brought them into the cartel, ensuring that the communist state would play by his capitalist rule. He created the Central Selling Organization, a shadowy, elegant mechanism by which a handful of chosen buyers, known as sightholders, were invited to London twice a year to purchase boxes of uncut stones at a price the Oppenheimer organization dictated. There was no negotiation. You took the box you were offered, or you were out. It was an empire built not on land, but on a system. By the late 1930s, Sir Ernest Oppenheimer had achieved what no one thought possible. He had turned a frivolous luxury, a trinket of the rich, into the most tightly controlled commodity on Earth. He had taken the chaos of the pit and the flood and forged it into a global machine of immense, quiet power. But as he stood at the apex of his creation, a new shadow was falling over the world and over his own legacy. The continent over which his empire was built, Africa, was stirring. The political structures of colonialism that had allowed him to operate with such freedom were beginning to crack. And in South Africa, a new, poisonous ideology was taking root, one that would place his family and his fortune at the center of a moral crucible. The empire of diamond, built on the blue ground, was about to face its most dangerous test. The legacy would not be inherited by the man who built it, but by the son who would have to navigate the fire to come. Ernest Oppenheimer died in 1957, an old man in a world he had shaped. He left behind a mechanism of such elegant control that it seemed to run on its own momentum. The Diamond Corporation, the Central Selling Organization, the alliance with the Soviets. It was a machine built to last, but the world had changed while he was building it. The winds of decolonization were sweeping across Africa. The certainties of the British Empire, the framework in which he had operated, were dissolving. And in his homeland, South Africa, the National Party had formalized its brutal vision into law: apartheid. The era of the empire builder was over. The era of the empire manager had begun. Harry Oppenheimer was never supposed to be the heir. He was the thoughtful son, the one who preferred books to boardroom, who saw the world in shades of gray, while his father saw it in the stark geometry of profit and control. Educated at Oxford, Harry returned to South Africa with a liberal conscience that sat uneasily with the inheritance awaiting him. He saw the injustice of the racial laws being passed in Pretoria. He saw the absurdity of a system that denied the vote to the very men who worked the mines that generated the nation's wealth. And he saw his father, Sir Ernest, a man of immense pragmatism who navigated the political currents with a simple philosophy: never oppose the government in power, keep the mines running, keep the shareholders happy, the rest is noise. The tension between them was not a shouting match, it was a silent. It was the silence in the car as they drove past the dusty townships where black workers were packed into single-sex hostels, their families forbidden from joining them. It was the silence at the dinner table when the apartheid laws were discussed in the newspaper. Ernest had built his empire by adapting to the political realities of his time, however distasteful. He had made peace with the Afrikaner nationalists after their election in 1948, understanding that a stable South Africa, even a morally repugnant one, was better for business than a chaotic one. Harry, inheriting this empire, would have to decide if he could do the same. When Ernest died, Harry stepped into the chairmanship of both De Beers and Anglo-American. He was now the most powerful businessman in Africa, a figure of almost unimaginable wealth and influence. But he was also a man haunted by a question his father had never asked. What is the cost of this empire? He began to use his power in ways that shocked the establishment. He poured millions into the Progressive Party, the only political party in South Africa that openly opposed apartheid and advocated for a non-racial franchise. He became the financier of the opposition, a patron to liberals like Helen Suzman, the lone voice in Parliament for decades, who stood against the rising tide of nationalist legislation. He did not do this quietly. He gave speeches that were heard from Cape Town to London, condemning the policy of separate development as economic nonsense and morally indefensible. He argued that the prosperity of South Africa depended on the full participation of all its people. To the Afrikaner nationalists, he was a traitor, an Uitlander, an outsider in his own country. To his fellow businessmen, he was a naive idealist risking the stability that made their fortunes. To the black majority, he was a paradox. He funded their opposition, yet his companies were the largest employer of black labor in the country. His mines paid the lowest wages and maintained the very past laws he claimed to abhor. He was the king of a system he was trying to dismantle. This was the tragedy of Harry Oppenheimer. He was a liberal, perhaps a genuine one, trapped in the body of a monopoly. He used his wealth to fund the African National Congress in exile, yet his security forces were notorious for suppressing labor unions on his mind. He would meet with black leaders like Gatsha Buthelezi in private, discussing a future of power sharing, while in public, his companies profited from the forced labor of a disenfranchised people. He believed with a conviction that bordered on faith that economic progress, the relentless engine of his minds, would inevitably break down the barriers of race. He thought capital was colorblind. He was wrong. The 1960 Sharpeville massacre, where police fired on a peaceful protest against the past laws, killing 69 people, shook the world. For Harry, it was a personal reckoning. He watched the government declare a state of emergency, banning the ANC and imprisoning a generation of leaders, including a young lawyer named Nelson Mandela. He continued his funding, continued his speeches, but the space for liberal dissent was closing. The government, suspicious of his power, launched inquiries into his companies, trying to break his hold on the economy. He fought them off with the same financial acumen his father had used to build the cartel. He was a master of the game, even as he questioned the rules. His son, Nicky, would follow him into the business, and the paradox would deepen. The Oppenheimers remained the first family of South African capitalism, a dynasty that had built the infrastructure of a nation: the roads, the railways, the cities, while simultaneously being the architects of a labor system that had brutalized generations. They were the patrons of the anti-apartheid movement and the titans of the system that made apartheid profitable. The contradiction was not lost on Harry. As the 1970s dawned and the world began to turn against South Africa with sanctions and divestment campaigns, he found himself isolated. The business community, once unified behind him, began to splinter. The young radicals in the townships were no longer interested in liberal paternalism. They wanted liberation. Harry, now an old man, looked out from his Johannesburg penthouse. Across the city he had helped build, the skyscrapers of the gold mining houses, the sprawling suburbs, and the vast, dusty townships stretching to the horizon. He had inherited an empire built on a continent, and he had tried to use its power for something resembling justice. But the empire was a machine with its own logic, a logic of extraction and control that predated and would likely outlast him. He had become a prisoner of his own inheritance, a liberal king ruling over a kingdom he could no longer justify. The final reckoning for the Oppenheimers was not yet written. It would come in the next generation, in a world where apartheid would finally fall, and a new question would rise from its ashes. After the system falls, what do you do with the fortune built upon it? While the political storm raged in South Africa, the diamond empire Harry Oppenheimer managed was undergoing a transformation of a different kind. It was becoming invisible. The genius of the Oppenheimer system, the mechanism his father had built, was that it did not need to be seen to be effective. The mines, the sorting houses, the London sites, these were the engine room. But the true power of the empire was not in the ground. It was in the mind. It was in the creation of a global desire so potent, so universal, that it felt not like a marketing campaign, but like a biological imperative. This was the era when De Beers stopped selling a stone and started selling a dream. The architect of this transformation was a New York advertising executive named N.W. Iyer. In 1938, at the behest of Ernest Oppenheimer, they were tasked with a monumental challenge: create a mass market for diamonds in the United States. Before this, diamonds were a luxury of the European aristocracy, a niche product. The Americans, with their vast, emerging middle class, had shown little interest. They preferred other gemstones, or they spent their money on cars and refrigerator. The Iyer agency understood that they were not just selling a product, they were selling a symbol. They needed to attach the diamond to the most powerful human emotion they could find: love. The campaign they crafted was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation. It was subtle, patient, and relentless. They seeded stories in newspapers and magazines about the romantic traditions of the aristocracy, traditions that, for the most part, they invented. They placed diamonds in the hands of movie stars, ensuring that in every glamorous photograph, a diamond was the focal point. They sponsored radio programs and later television shows, where the diamond was presented as the inevitable, the only acceptable expression of a man's devotion. And in 1947, a young copywriter named Frances Jarity, working late at her desk, penned a slogan that would become, arguing, the most successful advertising tagline in history. She wrote, "A diamond is forever." It was simple, it was poetic, and it was a lie wrapped in a truth. It worked on 3 levels. First, it told the consumer that a diamond's value was eternal, a hedge against the uncertainty future. Second, it told the woman that a man's love, if it was real, was measured in carats. But the third and most cunning level was the one aimed at the market itself. A diamond is forever meant that no one would sell their diamond. The secondary market, the one place where the illusion of scarcity could be broken by a flood of inherited stones, was neutralized. A diamond, once bought, was taken out of circulation forever. The cartel had just locked the back door. This was the era of De Beers as a cultural force. The company, under Harry's direction, became a kind of global mood setter. They controlled not just the supply, but the narrative. They launched campaigns in Japan, a country with no tradition of diamond engagement rings, and within a generation, created a market where 4 out of 5 brides received a diamond. They did the same in Germany, Brazil, and across the developing world. The diamond became a universal language, a portable, glittering certificate of a modern, Western-style commitment. The Oppenheimers, from their quiet offices in London and Johannesburg, were not just selling rocks. They were exporting a culture. But this era of total control, this world of De Beers, was also an era of profound secrecy and gatekeeping. At the center of it was the site in London. Twice a year, a select group of dealers, the site holders, would travel to a nondescript building on Charterhouse Street. They would be led into a room where, on a table, lay dozens of small, unmarked boxes. Each box contained a pre-selected assortment of rough diamond, worth millions of dollars. There was no catalog, no negotiation. A site holder was given a box, told the price, and given a choice: take it or be struck from the list forever. It was a system of absolute discipline, enforced by the threat of exile. The site holders were not customers. They were vassals, the extended arm of the Oppenheimer monopoly, responsible for cutting and polishing the stones and then feeding them into the ire-created dream machine. This system created a world of staggering wealth, but also of immutable hierarchy. In Africa, the mines themselves became closed society. The town of Orapa in Botswana, built entirely by De Beers in the 1970s, was a perfect company town, a model of efficiency, but also a place where every aspect of life was dictated by the corporation. The Diamond Empire was a state within states, a private government with its own currency, the diamond, and its own laws. For the Oppenheimers, this was the culmination of their grandfather's vision, a mechanism so perfect, so self-sustaining, that it seemed to exist outside of history. Yet even as the "A Diamond is Forever" campaign reached its peak, the cracks in the facade were beginning to show. The political pressure on South Africa was intensifying, and the Oppenheimer name, inextricably linked to the apartheid state, was becoming toxic in the global markets they had cultivated. In the diamond fields of Angola and Sierra Leone, a new kind of conflict was brewing, one that would give rise to a terrifying new term: blood diamond. The system that had been designed to bring order to the diamond trade was about to be hijacked by chaos. The empire of control, built on the blue ground and maintained by a century of Oppenheimer will, was about to face its final, most destabilizing challenge. The light in the diamond was about to cast a very dark shadow. By the 1990s, the world had changed, and the Oppenheimer dynasty, after nearly a century of unbroken rule, found itself standing at the edge of an abyss. The fall of apartheid in South Africa, culminating in the election of Nelson Mandela in 1994, was a moment of triumph for the human spirit. For the Oppenheimers, it was a moment of profound reckoning. Harry, now in his 80s, watched the man he had secretly funded for decades walk free from prison and into the presidency. The paradox of his life had reached its climax. He had been a liberal in a system of hate, a financier of liberation from the seat of oppression. The new South Africa, the Rainbow Nation, would judge him not by his intentions, but by the legacy of his empire. The first blow to the old order came not from a political rival, but from a journalist. In the 1990s, reports began to emerge from the civil wars in Angola, Sierra Leone, and Liberia of a horrific new trade. Warlords like Fade Sanko of the Revolutionary United Front were funding their brutal campaigns by seizing diamond fields and forcing enslaved civilians to dig for stones. These diamonds, sold illicitly on the world market, bypassed the De Beers cartel entirely. They were called conflict diamond, or blood diamond. The term was a poison dart aimed at the heart of the industry De Beers had created. For the first time, the public began to see the diamond not as a symbol of eternal love, but as a symbol of eternal violence. Activists, led by organizations like Global Witness, launched campaigns that exposed the connection between the glittering stone in a ring and the maimed hands of a child miner in Sierra Leone. The pressure was immense. De Beers, the company that had spent a century creating an aura of purity around the diamond, was now being accused of being the godfather of a bloody trade. Harry's successor, his son Nicky Oppenheimer, understood that the old model of absolute control was no longer viable. The world demanded transparency, and the cartel was a creature of secrecy. In a move that would have been unthinkable to his grandfather, Nicky made a historic decision. De Beers would stop buying diamonds from any source outside its own mine. It would shut the doors of the central selling organization. It would, in effect, dismantle the monopoly his grandfather had built. It was an act of strategic retreat, a recognition that the Oppenheimer era was ending. But the final act was still to come. In the early 2000s, a new player emerged, the government of Botswana. This small, landlocked country, which had been transformed by De Beers into the world's largest diamond producer by value, began to demand a larger share of the wealth. The Oppenheimers had always had a special relationship with Botswana, a partnership that was, in many ways, the most successful and equitable mining relationship in Africa. But the tide of history was against the dynasty. The era of private empires controlling the resources of nations was over. The Botswanan government, led by a new generation of leaders, negotiated a deal that fundamentally shifted the balance of power. De Beers would move its sorting and sales operation from London to Gaborone, the capital of Botswana. The center of the diamond world would leave the city where it had been ruled by the Oppenheimers for 80 years. The final decision came in 2012. Nicky Oppenheimer, the third generation, sat across a table from the board of Anglo-American, the mining giant his grandfather had founded. He was selling the family's 40% stake in. The price was $5.1 billion. It was the end. The dynasty that had begun with a young German immigrant staring into a pit in Kimberley was voluntarily walking away from the empire they had built. There were no dramatic boardroom coups, no hostile takeover, just a quiet transaction, a transfer of shares, a closing of an era. The Oppenheimers, who had controlled the world's supply of diamonds for 3 generations, were now just wealthy private citizens. What remains of their legacy? It is a question with no simple answer. In southern Africa, the answer is the cities they built. Johannesburg, the city of gold, owes its existence to the infrastructure of Anglo-American. The roads, the hospitals, the schools, the very skeleton of the region's industrial economy bears the Oppenheimer imprint. They were the architects of modernity on a continent they also helped exploit. In the townships, the answer is different. It is the memory of the past laws, the single-sex hostel, the migrant labor system that tore families apart for a century, a system their minds perfected. The wealth of the Oppenheimers was built on the backs of men who were paid a pittance to descend into the blue ground, their lungs filling with dust, their lives measured not in carats, but in shilling. In the world of marketing, their legacy is the engagement ring itself, a tradition they largely invented. Every time a man kneels with a small velvet box, he is performing a ritual scripted by the Oppenheimer advertising machine. It is perhaps their most enduring monument, a cultural idea so powerful it feels like instinct. And in the realm of ethics, their legacy is the Kimberley process, the international certification scheme created in the wake of the blood diamond scandal, a flawed, imperfect system, but a system of accountability that their old monopoly would never have tolerated. They helped create the problem, and then, under immense pressure, they helped craft the solution. The Oppenheimer story is not a story of villains or heroes. It is a story of power. It is a story of how a single family, through ambition, foresight, and a willingness to operate in the gray spaces of empire, could bend a global market to their will. They built a machine that turned a crystalline carbon into the most coveted substance on Earth. They controlled not just a commodity, but a human emotion. And in the end, the world they helped create, a world of global supply chains, of ethical scrutiny, of nations demanding sovereignty over their resources, no longer had a place for them. As the sun sets on the South African veldt, the great mines of Kimberley are silent now, their pits filled with water, their headgear rusting. Tourists walk the rim of the Big Hole, buying souvenir stones in the gift shop, unaware of the century of history buried beneath their feet. In Gaborone, the new headquarters of De Beers hums with activity, a symbol of a new, more equitable era. And in Johannesburg, the Oppenheimer family still lives, their fortune intact, their name still spoken with a mixture of reverence and resentment. They are the ghosts at the feast of modern Africa, the dynasty that built an empire on a continent, and then in the end chose to let it go. The light in a diamond is just light, refracted through carbon, but the light that shines on it, the history that passes through it, is never pure. The Oppenheimers understood this. They built their empire not on the stone itself, but on the shadow it casts. And now, as the last echoes of their rule fade, the story remained. A story of dust and diamonds, of fire and flood, of a family who looked into a hole in the earth and saw not a void, but a future they could own. The empire is gone. The light remains.